The UFC, or Ultimate Fighting Championship, is the premier league for the world's best mixed martial arts fighters. These fighters are amazing. For years they've honed their skills, cross-training in several martial arts to become the best at hand-to-hand combat. Gladiators are armed combatants who violently fought each other for the entertainment of society, mainly during and after the fall of the Roman Empire. Gladiators participated in ludi, or public games sponsored by the state, and munis, public entertainment sponsored by rich citizens. These fighters were also amazing. They endured harsh conditions and years of training to hone their skills. Thousands of years, different regimens, training styles, and technology separates these top combatants. What we think about between a gladiator and a UFC fighter would be an amazing match. Let's discuss the fighters and the advantages or disadvantages they might have over each other. But how about we make the fight a tad more fair? The gladiator can have a groin protector too. Contrary to what a certain movie might portray, gladiators did not always fight to the death. Only about 1 in 9 or 11% of matches ended with someone dying. But you ask, what about the chariot races? The crowds clamoring for pollice verso, aka the crowd voting with their thumbs to kill a gladiator. Well, a typical day of entertainment at a coliseum had several different events. During the morning session, there were animal entertainers, mainly animals fighting each other to the death, would be showcased. Around midday, when the crowds thinned for lunch, the B entertainment, such as the executions of criminals and dissidents, would take place. These events might involve fights to the death between the condemned or the condemned versus animals. The afternoon games were prime time, reserved for gladiatorial combat, chariot races, and recreations of famous battles. Thousands of years later, a full day of Roman games has jumbled into a single pop culture narrative about gladiators chaotically fighting to the death. Sometimes gladiators did fight hungry animals in contests called venationes, or wild beast hunts. Also, occasionally there were bouts to the death between gladiators, but overall fights lasted until there was a decisive outcome. Perhaps a competitor was wounded or collapsed. There were rules of combat, and most bouts actually had referees who were often retired gladiators. The referees could caution fighters or pause a match. Sometimes a ruler or rich sponsor watching a fight did weigh in to achieve a certain outcome, but in general most audiences wanted to see a well-crafted match between skilled fighters with a bit of showmanship. This is not too different than the UFC bouts of today. Audiences want a great fight between professional fighters, and judges and referees to ensure them to be so. Historians dispute when and where gladiators and gladiator games started. It's thought that Etruscans started the tradition, and the bloodthirsty Roman Empire continued and added on to the tradition. Some young men of noble families volunteered to become gladiators when ludi grew very popular, but the majority of gladiators were slaves and/or prisoners of war taken captive by the Romans. If in good health, a POW might be sold in the marketplace. A lanista or gladiator trainer would purchase prisoners and train them to fight. The lanista might be backed by sponsors, or sponsors might rent gladiators out and put up funds to train a certain gladiator for a certain fight. Gladiators received board and training but weren't paid a salary. However, they could win prize money or receive gifts from fans. Sometimes successful gladiators were able to buy their freedom. Becoming a gladiator took a lot of training, and it was quite an expensive investment. Unless they were well compensated by a sponsor, a lanista was not going to let a skilled warrior die and lose money. Actually, that's somewhat similar to the general rules regarding fights and companies carrying insurance for professional fighters of today. Aside from the ethics and human rights issues, if a UFC fighter is killed or seriously injured, it's bad business. A typical UFC fighter doesn't actually make much of a living from fighting. It's the highly ranked fighters who are household names who make bank. Per a 6-year agreement UFC made with Reebok in 2015, in-ring sponsorships by any company other than Reebok are banned. However, fighters can earn money via endorsements, often through video or social media posts. In recent years, some UFC fighters have spoken out against the company's inadequate pay structure and even tried to unionize. Some UFC fighters made more money on the amateur MMA fighting circuit and found themselves starting over with beginner wages once they joined the UFC. Laniste often ran gladiator schools where the gladiators lived and trained. There were multiple schools scattered throughout the Roman Empire, each providing warriors for a nearby amphitheater. The gladiators lived in barrack-style housing and were well fed. Laniste knew that in addition to thrilling matches, the audiences wanted to look at beefcakes. A study of 1,800-year-old bones excavated from a gladiator graveyard in Turkey showed that nearly all the gladiators buried there had a vegetarian diet primarily consisting of wheat, barley, and beans with little to no meat products. Surprisingly, that's not too different from the approach many athletes, including UFC fighters, take to their diets today. Some of the bones also showed mineral deposits. Apparently, after training or fighting, the combatants drank a health-boosting tonic made from the ashes of plants to help their bodies recover. Yeah, that sounds sorta nasty, but tropical undertow, feral cherry, or any of the other electrolyte-packed sports drinks athletes consume today would probably gross a gladiator out. Lastly, the bones showed evidence of healed wounds. Gladiators received top-notch medical care of the day and sometimes survived horrible wounds. Although not as high-tech or scientifically accurate as the nutrition and healthcare UFC fighters receive, gladiators were fit and healthy. Unfortunately, archaeology has yet to uncover any specific gladiator training manuals, so we don't know much about gladiators' daily schedules. However, we do have art, graffiti, and literature which provide some clues as to how the gladiators trained. The Romans revered the ancient Greeks for their Olympic athletes and used something like the Greeks' tetrad system, a 4-day regimen. Day 1, a short yet intense prep day workout. Day 2, high-intensity workout where fighters gave their absolute best. Day 3, a rest day, and Day 4, a medium-intensity workout, and repeat. The Romans understood that a diverse itinerary of activities was best for producing strong fighters. Many UFC fighters and other professional athletes adhere to the tetrad system today. It's still considered one of the best programs for achieving athletic goals. Calisthenics or bodyweight exercises were a huge part of gladiator training. They also weightlifted using halteres, an ancient version of dumbbells. Generally, when entering the school, the trainer would assess a gladiator's body and existing fighting skills to help determine which type of combat specialty the gladiator should train to become. There were over 20 types of gladiators who wielded a wide variety of weapons and had unique fighting styles. A Thracian was probably the most popular type of gladiator. They fought sporting a curved blade that was usually around 13 inches long, round shield, and broad helmets with a griffin insignia. The Murmillo was armed with a gladius or longsword, carried an oblong shield, and dressed something like a Roman soldier. The Retiarius or net fighter employed a net similar to a fisherman's to ensnare opponents, a trident used for jabbing, and a 4-pronged dagger of last resort. They didn't wear helmets, but some wore galerus or a metal shoulder shield to protect their necks. Beyond strength exercises, gladiators spent the majority of their time training in their fighting style. Trainees generally started with wooden training weapons and progressed through various ranks. Once they began sparring with their partners, they would fight in the training arena attached to the school. These arenas, while considerably smaller than the amphitheaters where the gladiator games were staged, were still large, having seating for an audience of a couple thousand people. These public mock battles cured combatants of stage fright and got them used to possible distractions such as the roar of the crowd. After a long day of practice or fighting, a gladiator would rejuvenate themselves by spending time soaking in Roman baths. In fact, spa treatments were considered so vital for a gladiator's rest and recovery that most schools had them on site. An archaeological excavation at the site of a gladiator school in the ancient city of Carnuntum, near what is now Vienna, Austria, recovered a large bath complex. Not too different a practice from the whirlpool and massage treatments a UFC fighter might receive after an intense day of training or competition. To become a UFC fighter, there isn't one set route. Many UFC fighters have gotten their start wrestling at a top-tier high school or studying martial arts as they were growing up. Even if a wannabe UFC fighter did neither of these things, if they were still in their early 20s, athletic, very determined, and disciplined, they still have a small shot at becoming a UFC fighter. Here's how one path to becoming a UFC fighter could work. Our fighter spent about 4 or 5 years becoming a good amateur MMA fighter. That means he gained a high level of skill in wrestling and competed at the college level. He studied Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or BJJ and has an adult purple belt. A purple belt is the intermediate adult ranking, and it takes a consistent practitioner about 2.5 to 3 years to reach this status. He also has 3 years of kickboxing experience and some knowledge of Muay Thai and Judo. Our fighter is pursuing MMA as a lifestyle. He adheres to a carefully calibrated diet. He has a consistent training schedule based on the tetrad system. In addition to martial arts, he lifts weights and stretches for flexibility. He's involved in the MMA community and has joined a local league. He's actively building a network of colleagues and workout partners in the same way that a gladiator would have a familia gladiatoria, or a chosen gladiator family of comrades. He started to fight on the amateur level and wins a decent amount of matches. He's thinking about his brand and building a social media presence. He's maybe gotten some sponsorships from a local company such as a gym or sporting goods store. Our fighter keeps on grinding. He spends another few years continuing to study and practice. He's now a brown belt in BJJ and has masterful wrestling skills. He's picked up some Taekwondo. He's made a name for himself on the MMA amateur fighting circuit and has won bouts both nationally and internationally. At this point, he's ready for the UFC. What he needs now is luck and timing. By this time, the UFC's probably already aware of him. Their scouts attend amateur MMA fights and keep tabs on upcoming talent. UFC also periodically holds casting calls to find new fighters. Our fighter attends a tryout for the Ultimate Fighter and ends up being signed to a 5-year contract. Now all he has to do is rise through the ranks and make a name for himself as a UFC fighter. Whew! So what if our UFC fighter goes up against a Thracian gladiator of roughly the same height and weight? Each fighter might have a slight advantage if the fight's taking place in their home milieu. While the UFC fighter probably wouldn't be disturbed by the crowds, his sense of space might be off-kilter. The amphitheater has an immense fighting arena as compared to a UFC fighting ring. And also, he'd be dealing with the stench of a society who hasn't yet discovered deodorant. The Thracian would be cool with a modern crowd. He can adapt to the compact fighting space, but's probably thrown off by the lights and cameras. Sorry, Thracian, we're gonna go with a modern arena. Once the fighting starts, the gladiator comes out swinging. His sword gives him a superior reach. The UFC fighter's boxing gloves aren't that great for protecting his hands against the Thracian's shield. However, the UFC fighter is quicker and rapidly adapts to the way the Thracian fights. They both have tricks up their sleeves, but the UFC fighter has superior footwork aided by his kickboxing practice. The gladiator begins to have a little trouble as the UFC fighter keeps switching between fighting styles. The fight might come down to stamina. A UFC fight goes for either 3 rounds or 5 rounds for a championship title. Each round lasts up to 5 minutes. In between rounds, the fighters get a 1-minute break, so a 3-round fight is max 17 minutes and a 5-round fight is max 29 minutes. Fights may end early due to knockout, submission, doctor stoppage, etc. From descriptions of fights found in literature, historians think that gladiator fights on average ranged from 15 to 20 minutes. The gladiator is slowing. With each move, his sword and shield feel heavier, and the UFC fighter may have it. But our Thracian warrior's mentality was forged in a world without posturepedic beds or toilet paper. He's beyond tough. The gladiator feints and strikes, drawing blood. And that's it, folks. The Thracian wins. Yeah, though it would be a tough match, we totally think that Gladiator would beat a UFC fighter. Now about the ladies. There's a bunch of amazing and tough female fighters in the UFC. Their origin story would be similar to our UFC fighters' beginning. Many years of various martial arts trainings, fighting on the amateur MMA circuit, and building a rep before being signed to the UFC. But what about female gladiators? Well, technically they were called gladiatrix and were considered an exotic rarity. Much of the time they were showcased for titillation. They were often portrayed in the amphitheater as Amazons, the female warriors of Greek myth. Unfortunately, not a lot of information is known about them. Some inscriptions suggest they trained with private tutors rather than regular gladiator schools. Few records have been found regarding their battles. Mainly, they fought with each other and wild animals. Rarely did they fight men. Generally, they were equipped with a dagger, belt, rectangular shield, and wore loincloths and helmets. They may or may not have worn greaves or leg protection, and manica, arm protection. In 200 AD, Emperor Septimius Severus, angry over the ribald and harassing taunts from audiences when gladiatrix were fighting, banned female gladiators altogether. We think a UFC female fighter with her more consistent training and fighting opportunities would beat a gladiatrix hands down. And now that you reached the end of the video, why not keep the watch party going? Navy SEALs are tough, right? But is a Navy SEAL tough enough to take on the Spartan 300? Braveheart was an awesome movie, but is it an accurate portrayal of William Wallace? Click here to find out.